Welcome to the class. This is our third lesson, and our subject today will be the Exodus stage. Now remember, this series will be in 7 stages. The Old Testament is written and presented in 7 stages. We've covered stage number 1, the creation stage, our foundation. We've covered stage number 2, the patriarchal stage. That would be God dealings with with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of the Bible. And then today, the Exodus stage. But you'll also remember that I said in a previous session that the Bible is not written in chronological order. That is, in the order in which the events happen. So you can take the Old Testament from Genesis over to the book of Nehemiah and stop. Then you have to pick out the other books and insert them in their proper place. And that's the case today. We have to go over to the book of Job, and we have to take the book of Job out of its position, and we have to move it over somewhere and insert it somewhere into the region of Genesis and Exodus. Now, we don't know exactly when these events took place, which we read about in the book of Job, but we're going to take the liberty of placing them at the end of the book of Genesis. And also remember that this course is a survey course. We see the Bible from a bird's eye point of view. We're not here to study every detail. We're just here to pick up the high points. So we'll be very brief with the book of Job. The book of Job is about one thing: a sovereign God and his suffering servant. We don't understand all that happened to Job, but we know that his terrible troubles ended up for the glory of God. Now, Job was caught in a terrible ordeal. He lost everything that he had. He lost, as a matter of fact, all of his earthly possessions, but there's one thing that Job did not lose. He did not lose his faith in God. He lost his family. He lost his finances. He lost almost everything as far as his life is concerned. His health. He almost lost his wife. He lost his friends. Seems like he had nothing left in this world. But the lesson of Job is he never lost sight of God. He never wavered in his commitment to God. At one point in his trials, when he had lost his oxen, his donkeys, his farm hands had been killed, his family, his herds, his herdsmen, his camels had been stolen, his sons and daughters had been killed, and he ended up with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his foot. In the midst of all that, his friends came to him and began to chastise him. And they began to say to him, Job, if you'd get the sin out of your life, these things would not have happened to you. And Job meditated and prayed, and there was nothing which he had not repented of, but yet his trials continued. And Job knew in his heart that he was right with God. It wasn't anything he had done that had brought these things on. But what Job did not know was that God had met with Satan. Or I should have said, Satan had met with God. And Satan had put it before God, if you wouldn't watch over this man the way you do, he wouldn't serve you. And so God put Satan to the test. And he proved Satan was a liar and that Satan was wrong in the strength of Job in never doubting God. I think the lesson here is for us that we must be strong for the Lord, and we must prove that Satan is a liar. Every time we have a victory over temptation, we prove that Satan's wrong and the Word of God is right. Now, let's look, if you will, to the book of Exodus, the second book of Moses. And let's continue our look at the stages of the Old Testament. Today we see not only the creation stage, the patriarchal stage, but we see the Exodus stage. I would call this section the making of a man. We find the life of Moses. The book of Exodus covers some 80 years. It begins with Pharaoh's persecution of the family of Joseph. When we left off in our last session, we were talking about Joseph and his family coming into the land of Egypt. Oh, how well they were provided for. Pharaoh set them up in the best part of Egypt. And they lived there quite contented for some years. Let me give you just a little history, if I may, of the men of the Bible. We're not sure when Abraham was in the land of Mesopotamia, but it could have been somewhere, the history of Mesopotamia could have gone back to somewhere around 5000 BC. Abraham lived in Mesopotamia somewhere around 2000 BC. Now, when Joseph went into Egypt, we know that the pyramids were some 700 years old. So, to give you a perspective of the timetable, Joseph was probably in Egypt about 1750 BC. And then Moses delivered the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage about 1350, I'll say 50. We know the Bible says that the children of Israel were in Egypt some 430 years. So we know that they left somewhere around this time period. There has risen up a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. There's a reason for that. A new group of people had come in to power who were not in power at the time of Joseph. And they began to kill off the Hebrews for fear. God had blessed them. God had multiplied them. And the Pharaoh said, what if they were to rise up against us as we rose up against the other group of Egyptians and drove them from the country? We need to make sure this doesn't happen to us. So he began to enslave the people of his country, Hebrews and others, who were not natives to Egypt. And so they were enslaved. About 75 years after the death of Joseph, Israel became oppressed and enslaved. And we find in the book of Exodus that God had grace. He extended his grace as the Israelites began to pray. In chapter number 2, in verse 23, they cried out unto God, and God heard them. And God's man Moses was born. Now God works very slowly sometimes. But what God does is very, very fine and very, very permanent. God does things well. You know the story of little baby Moses and how God raised him up as a little baby in the Nile River. And how he became a boy in the palace. And then how he had to flee Egypt because he killed the taskmaster. And there he became a shepherd in the land of Midian. Moses' life was in 3 increments. He was 40 years as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. 40 years as a shepherd in the Midian desert. And 40 years as the man of God. It was there in the Midian desert where God began to mold Moses, and he made him ready. He met with him at the burning bush. He met the great I Am. You know, God's name is so wonderful. The name of God, literally in the Hebrew, is the Eternal One. He is not past or present or future. He is all of those things. He is eternal. So when Moses said, "Who are you?" he said, "You just tell the children of Israel, I Am hath sent you." I Am has the connotation of eternity. I Am is not present. I Am is not past. I Am is not future. God is eternal. That day, Moses met the Eternal One. And he had a job for him to do, to deliver the children of Israel from bondage. Moses was obedient, even though he gave a few excuses. He finally did what God would have him to do. And he met God's enemy, Pharaoh. God sent the plagues upon Egypt. The plagues were each and every one an attack not only upon Pharaoh and upon the land of Egypt, but upon every god which they served. Egypt had many gods. They had frog gods and cow gods and gods of almost every description. And when God said to Pharaoh, "I want you to let my people go, that they may go into the wilderness to serve me," Pharaoh said, "Who is this Lord, this God, this," literally in the Hebrew, Yahweh, "that I should obey him?" And he sent Moses away. And Moses warned him, if you do not obey God, the plagues will come upon Egypt. And so they did. The plague of turning the water into blood. God said to Moses, "Stretch out your rod." He turned the water into blood. He brought the great wave of frogs. And then when Pharaoh continued to disobey God, he brought a great plague of lice and then flies. Now, think about it. Water into blood. Great waves of lice and flies. These are inconveniences, to say the least, but not nearly as bad as they were going to become. Now, Pharaoh could have gotten off with a few inconveniences, but he refused God, and so Moses began to bring disease of cattle and boils. This becomes painful to the people. And then when Pharaoh still would not listen to God, there was hail mingled with fire, the locust, and the great darkness. In other words, God began to show Pharaoh he was in charge not only of the elements of this world, but nature itself. And God proved to Pharaoh that he was the creator. Then there was the last plague. Pharaoh had made several compromises. He offered 4 compromises to Moses. Why don't you just worship God right here in the land of Egypt? But Moses said, I can't do that. God has sent us, God has commanded us to go into the wilderness to worship. So then Pharaoh began a second attempt. Well, why don't you go and worship, but don't go too far? Moses said to Pharaoh, I must follow God completely. So Pharaoh attempted a third compromise. Why don't you leave, but leave your children here? Go as far as you'd like, but leave your children in the land of Egypt. Moses again refused. And then Pharaoh began to attempt a fourth compromise. You and your children may go and go as far as you'd like, but leave all of your belongings here. And Moses made it very clear. We must obey God completely. This is always a trick of the devil, to get us to compromise, to serve God only a little bit, or to serve God just partly in the way that God would have us to. Don't go too far. Don't get too fanatical, but just do a little bit. We can't do that. We must completely serve God with no compromise. We must completely give Him all. We must give Him our all. Well, Pharaoh learned a valuable lesson that God demands our complete and total commitment. And the 10th plague came upon Egypt in the form of death. Now the Bible tells us that God had instructed Moses, all the children of Israel, to take a little lamb, kill the lamb, prepare the lamb for a meal, and then sprinkle the blood of that lamb on your door. God said, now tonight at the midnight hour, I will pass through the land. When I see the blood, I'll pass over you. I'll pass over your house. Now there was death in every home where there was not blood. The firstborn of every Egyptian died that evening. But let me also interject this. Not only was there death of the firstborn where there was no blood, but did you know there was also death in the homes of the Hebrews? But it was not the firstborn. It was the Lamb himself who took the place of the firstborn in death. And that is a picture of what Jesus did for us. He died in our place. The Lamb for the sinner. And so we have the Passover as a commemoration. And the outgrowth of that is the communion supper that we have in our church, the Lord's Supper, which we have in our churches, which is an outgrowth of the Passover. It means the same thing. A lamb has died in our place. We'll not have to die, but we can live eternally in the portals of glory because a lamb has given his life and died in our place. And God says, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Will not be required to give, to be penalized. Will not be required to go to hell for our sin. because Jesus has paid the price. And we've received him as our Savior. And now, as the Hebrews of old had the Lamb and his blood on their doorpost, the Lamb which died in their place, Jesus has died in our place. So Israel set out for a new place. Pharaoh said to Moses, I never want to see your face again. And the children of Israel were free to go. Moses led them into the wilderness en route to Sinai. They departed the city of Ramses, and Mount Sinai was 150 miles away over nothing but desert. And they would have to make this trip under difficult circumstances. Well, Pharaoh decided he had made a mistake. And he begins to pursue the children of Israel as they approach the Red Sea. And as they come to the edge of the Red Sea, God also tests the faith of his people. They look about them. Here is the great Red Sea before them. Here is the desert around them. And here are Pharaoh's armies pursuing them. They had no place to go. And God began to work with Moses, and he began to show him the way. Stretch out your rod, Moses. And he held his rod out over the Red Sea. The sea parted, and there was dry land. The children of Israel walked across to the other side. But when Pharaoh's armies pursued them, Moses once again stretched forth his rod. The waters closed in upon them, and all the armies of Pharaoh which pursued were drowned in the sea. Now the doubters have said the Red Sea was not deep enough for them to have worried about it. They could have sort of waded across to the other side. Well, there was still a miracle performed if that's true, because all of Pharaoh's armies were drowned in a foot of water. Take your miracle. Which one do you want? I believe, of course, that the water was deep. And there was a great miracle, not only in the parting of the waters, but in the saving of God's people. Now, they set out for their long journey by foot, 150 miles of burning desert, very little water, and God begins to test them. Oh, there's the pillar of cloud by day, and there's the pillar of fire by night to protect them. There was the song of redemption they sang on the other side of the Red Sea, but this soon faded when their food began to get short, when their water ran out, when they began to get weary of the journey. I find oftentimes in the Christian journey, I don't get tired of the journey, but I get tired in the journey. I don't get tired of serving the Lord, but I get tired while I'm serving the Lord. And they began to murmur, and they began to complain unto Moses. They began to say, if we hadn't listened to you, we wouldn't be in this mess. How soon we forget the miracles. How soon we forget how much God has done for us. But you see, God is forming a nation. And out there in the desert, He provides for them the water when they need it. He provides the meat. He provides the food in the way of manna. Manna means, what is it? When they saw it, they said, what is it? But it was good. And it sustained them. Sometimes along the journey, we don't understand all the circumstances. But God always provides, and He always brings us to a place where we can settle down and where we can serve the Lord. So He brought them to Sinai. And there at Sinai, God begins to deal with them in the law. He tests them again. And Moses goes up to the mount that he might commune with God, that he might give to Moses a set of laws. Not just 10 laws, not just 10 commandments, inscribed by the very finger of God in stone, but he told Moses about all the dietary laws, how to keep healthy, how to keep our bodies in good shape, what things to do to keep sanitation laws. He told Moses all of the things that he needed to know. And then he said, Moses, there's one more thing I'd like for you to do. I want you to build a tabernacle. This will be my dwelling place. And Moses, the children of Israel, will commune with me through the priests. And he picked Aaron to be the high priest, and his family would be the priests of God, and they would be the go-between, or the stand-between, the advocates between God and the people. And so Moses took the instructions back to the people. He found upon his return they had done an awful thing. They had made a god of gold. They had bowed down to the golden idol, the golden calf. And Moses, in his rage, destroyed the 10 Commandments. But he went back at God's beckoning call to the mount once again. And there God dealt with him and gave him a second set of commandments and reestablished himself with Moses and showed to the people through great violence and through an act of great retribution that they could not disobey God. And so Moses was victorious. And God set forth 3 sections of the law with Moses. The moral law, the 10 Commandments. The spiritual law, which was in the form of feasts and offerings. And then the social law, which has to do with everything from motherhood and fatherhood down to the ownership of property. But God led his people, and God blessed them. And God dealt with them and met with them. And every part of the tabernacle spoke of God. Every piece of furniture spoke of God and his dealings with men. No chairs in the tabernacle, because the priest's work was never done. But you know, when Jesus came, died on the cross, he ascended to the right hand of the Father and sat down at his right hand, because the work was finished in Jesus Christ. On the other day.